All right, good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for today's technical webinar covering blueprints of the airfield, making airport layout plans work. My name is Natalie Niskanen. I work for AirTAP, Airport Technical Assistance Program. We help Minnesota's public and private sector airport professionals improve the safety, quality, and efficiency of airport operations, and increase the use of new navigation materials, practices, and technology. And we are sponsored by the University of Minnesota Center for Transportation Studies and the Minnesota Department of Transportation's Office of Aeronautics. We offer training opportunities in conjunction with MnDOT Aeronautics, including the annual Airports Conference, an annual webinar series, and an annual wildlife hazard control workshop. And then we also have electronic and print newsletters covering airport management and related content for all Minnesota airports, large and small. Just a quick plug for other technical webinar series coming up. We have on April 7th, How to Make Your Airport Stand Out with Craig Anderson from Alexandria. So be sure to tune into that one and get registered on the website. And then for the main webinar series, the next in the series is next Thursday on March 19th, covering airports as energy nodes. Quick plug for our upcoming events, the biggest one being the Minnesota Airports Conference at the beautiful Grandview Lodge pictured here in Nisswa. We're excited this year to feature several opportunities to learn from fellow airport managers with lots of panelist discussions in lieu of endless PowerPoints. So if you're not registered yet, register today. Some housekeeping items for today's webinar. We will be sending out a post-webinar thank you email with a link to the recording once that's available, as well as a post-webinar survey. Please take a couple seconds to fill out the survey. We really appreciate your feedback and guidance for future topics. For today's webinar Q&A, we'll be using the chat. If you put in a Q&A, no worries, we'll look there too. But it's helpful if others can see your question, or you can comment and chat with each other in the chat box as today's presentation goes on. So Chris will give his presentation and then do Q&A at the end. And with that, I'll hand things over to Chris. Take it away.
Thanks, Natalie. Get my screen share going here. There we go. I think everybody have me?
Yep, looks good.
Thanks, Natalie. So as Natalie had just mentioned, I'm Chris Gardner, South Region Planner with MnDOT Aeronautics. I've been with Aeronautics since July here, but prior to that, I've worked in the private sector on airport planning and specifically airport layout plans since 2013. I've completed airport layout plans throughout the Midwest, many in Minnesota, North Dakota, Iowa, Wisconsin, as well as North Carolina. So a little bit about what we're going to cover today. So we are going to take a look at what is an airport layout plan and why do we do them. We're also going to look at some of the resources that we have developed from the state of Minnesota to help you with your, specifically with the state requirements for airport layout plans. Some of those resources include one of the foremost resources, your regional planner. Feel free to reach out to your regional planner anytime to discuss any planning needs. Some of the other resources we have available that we're going to cover today are the State of Minnesota ALP checklist, the State of Minnesota ALP reference video, which we'll watch shortly here, as well as the State of Minnesota ALP guidelines. We're also going to briefly discuss some State of Minnesota ALP considerations in completing your airport layout plan. So what is an airport layout plan? So an airport layout plan is a scaled graphical representation of the existing and future airport facilities, their location on the airport, and related clearance and dimensional information. The ALP is a major product of a master plan update which contains information used to program future funding assistance. I have that highlighted there. Let's keep that one in mind as we move forward. And to monitor the airport's compliance with design standards and grant assurances. And I'm sure everybody is super excited to hear about the program Future Funding Assistance. So we're gonna move that direction here shortly. So the ALP really shows what's going on at the airport right now, existing conditions, and creates a plan to accommodate future development over the next 20 years or so. So the ALP also allows the state to anticipate budgetary and procedural needs and to help protect the airspace and land use required for facility or aircraft approach procedure improvements. So this gives us a chance to plan for future funding needs and to help protect the land needed to develop the plan in full. Um, so also important here, and we're bringing up funding again. To receive state funding, all proposed airport improvement projects must be shown on an approved ALP, funding prioritization model. So we are going to take a look at that next here. And I hope everyone is somewhat familiar with the funding prioritization model that we've had for the last several years at the state here. So we just started talking about the airport layout plan. But I wanted to relate this back to the funding here. So here's our state funding prioritization model guide. And if we look at the system plan alignment on the left, we see that the first item on there is master plan and ALP. So this is directly in our grants, scoring procedure here. So if we look at that, master plan and ALP, that's 10 points. So the system plan alignment specifically is 60 points out of the 100 points available. If we look, the top, like I just mentioned, the top item on there is master plan and ALP at 10 points. So that's the big focus today, talking about the ALP. But I want to look at a couple other items on this scoring model as well, because they're going to relate directly back to the ALP. So if we also look under the transportation safety, under the system plan alignment, we see that we've got airspace obstructions on there. That's also 10 points. So we've got master plan ALP, and we also have airspace obstructions. Another 10 points there. The airspace obstructions for Part 77 surfaces are going to be identified on the airport layout plan. If we look at the other category under transportation safety, we see clear zones. This is going to be another one. It's an important one, and it's going to come up a couple more times in the presentation here today. So specifically, looking at clear zone ownership and or control. So this will be also identified on the airport layout plan. What is owned and what is under control via easement should be clearly shown on the airport layout plan. So now we've got 10, 20, 30 points are items that are going to be covered on the airport layout plan out of the 60 points for the whole system plan alignment here. But hold on, we got one more thing to look at on the scoring prioritization model. So if we take a look down on healthy communities, we also see zoning on here. So zoning is another 10 points. So now we're up to 40 points out of the 60 available for system plan alignment, all relating back to items that are going to be shown or accommodated via the airport layout plan. In addition, you'll see that it's not just the 10 points that you would gain. Having an incompliant ALP, having obstructions present, having partial or no clear zone ownership and no CZAP on file, and or having inadequate zoning will actually decrease points. So not only is it 40 of the 60 points, but it can also cost you some points not meeting these categories. So all the stuff that we just highlighted off the scoring prioritization model is stuff that will be included on the ALP and can be verified or utilized, verified on our end off of the ALP. So a couple other things I wanted to discuss real quick here. So there, in the context of airport layout plans, there's oftentimes some terms that are kicked around. We might say a NIPIUS ALP or a federal ALP, and we might say a non-NIPIUS or a state-only ALP. So I just want to differentiate here real quick. So NIPIUS, the National Plan of Integrated Airport Systems, indicating that those airports are eligible for FAA funds. So specifically for a NIPIUS ALP, there is the ARP SOP 2.0 checklist. But from a state perspective, we also have some additional items that we need to be included from the state standpoint in order to receive that state approval. Some of those additional items include the clear zone and airport zoning, as well as state revision blocks. For non-NIPIUS or state-only ALPs, we do have our own MnDOT Aero ALP checklist, and we will take a look at that in just a couple minutes here. But specifically, for those of you that might be familiar with the ARP SOP 2.0 checklist, this is a very familiar checklist. The state doesn't have the exact same requirements as the FAA, so this is kind of an abridged version of the SOP 2.0 checklist, just kind of removing some of the items that the state doesn't examine, but also includes the items that we do need, so specifically clear zones and airport zoning. So the thing that I really want to point out here with this is that, for a NIPIUS or federal ALP, we absolutely have to follow the ARP SOP 2.0 checklist, but we do also need the couple additional items, such as the clear zone and airport zoning, just to check the state box here. These items are also the same items that we need for the MnDOT checklist. So it's not doubling up of the checklists or anything like that. Almost everything in the SOP 2.0 checklist, or I should say everything in the Aero ALP checklist is already accommodated by the 2.0 checklist, with the exception of the clear zone and airport zone. So just wanted to kind of clarify that a little bit before we move forward. And today we're specifically kind of just focusing on the items needed from the state standpoint for us to be able to move forward with an approval on an airport layout plan. So a couple of the items that we just talked about for state resources were the example airport layout plan, the guidelines, the checklist, as well as the ALP guidance video that we have. So specifically, here's an example of the airport layout plan, the sample layout plan that we have developed for the state. So we're going to briefly walk through this, then we'll watch the video. And I do want to let everybody know that we do have all the information that we're covering today is available online on the Aeronautics website, and we will show you the location to where all this stuff can be accessed here towards the end of the webinar. But just real quick, taking a look at the example airport layout plan that we have, we do have an airport layout plan that was developed for North Star Regional Airport, XYZ, in Waterwood, Minnesota. So, nothing should be too wild here. Kind of standard ALP items. We've got windrows stuff, wind coverage tables, vicinity map, location map, title and revision blocks, sponsor approval, consultant approval, and DOT approval block. So the video will explain a little more too, but specifically, I think there are a couple sheets here likely combined, which is definitely okay. Encourage you to coordinate with your regional planner ahead of time on that. But, to be able to save some space, it looks like we've kind of combined title sheet and probably some airport data sheet elements here as well. So finally taking a look at an airport layout plan. So we've got an airport layout plan sheet here. Once again, North Star Regional Airport. So the airport layout plan sheet, also combining some airport data tables here, kind of showing the overall development. So the existing conditions at the airfield, as well as any proposed development in the building area, any runway extensions, as well as any proposed crosswind runways, anything like that, or additional runways. So ultimate airspace sheet. One special note on this is profiles for each runway end, Part 77 surface dimensions, as well as an obstruction table calling out any obstacles or obstructions that might not be present within the inner approach plan and profile sheets. Um, of special note here, relating to back to some of the funding, back to the zoning here, like we talked about, having adequate zoning on file is a metric for the scoring prioritization. But specifically, what I wanted to point out here is that what we have shown for airspace on the ultimate condition airspace sheet should be protected via the zoning that's on file. So this is the airspace that we want to protect for, is the ultimate conditions that we're planning for. So it's important to make sure that the zoning that we're going to show later in the ALP aligns with and protects for what we're showing on the ultimate airspace sheet here. So now hopping into some of the plan and profile sheets. Approach plan and profiles. So as we see on this sheet, it does show a proposed extension with existing and future approach surfaces. So you can kind of see the existing surface here coming off, definitely showing obstacles down in here. It looks like there's some trees. And if we see one of the obstacles here, it looks like in future conditions, when the runway is extended, that tree will in fact become a penetration. So that one is listed as a 2.7-foot penetration to the future Part 77 approach surface. And that one does have a disposition of to be removed. So just wanted to point out a couple of those items here. Once again, looking at the other end of the runway, approach plan and profile. Be sure to call out any traverseway or roadway crossings along with the surface clearance, surface height, information like that, as well as any prominent obstacles on both the plan view as well as the profile view down below. So then also, like I'd mentioned, proposed crosswind runway. If you do have a crosswind runway or maybe have a proposed crosswind runway planning a future one, make sure to include plan and profile sheets for any existing or future planned runway ends. So you can see here, we do have a plan and profile sheet for the proposed crosswind showing acquisition out to the limits of the clear zone that's proposed for that runway. Once again, calling out any traverseway surface clearances, as well as any obstacles. And once again, for a planned crosswind runway here. So a little bit deeper dive, closer look at the building area. Be sure to include building and taxiway, taxi lane data tables. Show all nav aids in critical areas. Show OFAs, any parking areas. Show tie-down layouts, parking areas for both aircraft and automobiles. And recommendations on that stuff can also be found in the SASP document that we have. And then for the land use and zoning sheet. So you can see on this sheet that we actually have existing and future safety zoning. So kind of based on the runway extension, and it looks like some approach improvements. Um, the zoning does in fact get quite a bit larger for the airport here. So in this example, they are showing both the existing zoning that is on file with the state, as well as the future zoning that would accommodate and protect for any of the proposed development that's being shown. So be sure that if like we had mentioned, we'd want the existing zoning that we have on file to match what we're showing for ultimate airspace. So this future zoning would accommodate the ultimate airspace. So in this instance, the state would be looking for a zoning update kind of after this airport layout plan is approved. So please keep that in mind as you move forward. And then kind of getting into the airport property inventory map. We would like all the property split up, kind of by the how it was initially acquired, and specifically would like meets, bearings, and distances on any of the property boundaries, essentially. And then we also have some data table requirements. So on this specific ALP, and depending on kind of the complexity of the airport property, the size of the airport property, you might be able to accommodate it on one sheet, having your property tables on the same sheet. But if you're not able to, you can definitely run a second sheet. But we do need all existing airport fee property identified, any existing airport easements identified, any property encumbrances identified, as well as any planned property acquisition or easement acquisitions. So, like I had mentioned, we do have the airport layout plan ALP review checklist, as well as the submission guidelines. So the checklist, for those of you that, like I had mentioned, that are familiar with SOP 2.0, it'll be a very familiar version, but a slightly more abridged version, as there are certain surfaces and such that MnDOT isn't necessarily concerned with. In addition, we do have the airport layout plan preparation and submission guidelines. And this is just a little bit more of a descriptive, provides some background information on why we're updating airport layout plans, what the update schedules are, and kind of just a little description on what we're looking for on some of those steps. Whereas the checklist is very much individual item. Is this item present? Yes or no? The guidelines are more of suggestions and recommendations here. But we do have a video that kind of works well with our checklist and kind of walks you through that. So I am going to queue up that video for us right now.
An airport layout plan is a critical document required for all public airports that receive state or federal funding in Minnesota. The ALP is a set of drawings that provide a detailed snapshot of an airport's facilities and future development plans. It shows existing infrastructure, as well as planned improvements in key timeframes. Keeping your ALP up to date is essential, as it allows MnDOT to better understand and address funding needs across the entire state aviation system. This video will walk you through MnDOT's specific requirements and best practices for ALP formatting to ensure your plans meet all state standards. To standardize ALPs from airports across the state, MnDOT provides a detailed ALP checklist that itemizes all the required elements for each sheet of the ALP drawing set. Throughout the example ALP drawings, you'll notice reference labels like 1A or 3C6. These alphanumeric labels correspond directly to checklist items. For instance, if we look at the airport layout drawing sheet, we see label 3C6K next to the existing PAPI label. Going to the checklist, section 3C covers layout of existing and proposed facilities and features. Item 3C6 specifies runway details, and subset K specifies navigation aids. The labels allow you to easily cross-reference the drawings to the checklist to verify that your ALP sheets include all necessary components to meet MnDOT requirements. In some cases, checklist items that are technically assigned to different sheets can be combined onto a single ALP sheet if there is sufficient space. For example, you could put the wind roses and other data from the airport data sheet onto the title sheet in the available space. Any proposed combinations must be coordinated with your MnDOT Office of Aeronautics Regional Airport Planner beforehand to ensure changes meet their standards. We can see this in action on the example title sheet here, which includes the vicinity map, which is checklist item 1H, combined with the wind roses and other data from the airport data sheet found in 2B. The main airport layout drawing then combines even more with sections for data tables from Airport Data Sheet 2, as well as the airport layout plan components from Sheet 3, like the runways, taxiways, approaches, and more. Now that you understand how the map and checklist work in tandem, there are a few specific items on each sheet we'd like to call to your attention. In Sheet 3, the Airport Airspace sheet, be sure to identify all Part 77 airspace surfaces and include 50-foot elevation contours. This is crucial for understanding potential obstructions. Sheets 4 and 5 focus on the approach details for each runway end. Provide both plan and profile views for all existing and future runway ends. Be sure to identify any significant obstacles in the plans, profiles, and obstruction tables. Similarly, Sheets 6 and 7 depict plans and profiles for any proposed future runway ends. Again, be diligent in identifying obstacles for these planned runways. Sheet 8, the terminal area drawing, provides a more focused view of existing and future development in the core airport complex. When working on this sheet, be sure to contact MnDOT Navigation Aids and Operations for guidance on siting requirements for any AWAS. On Sheet 9, include any existing or proposed state airport zoning. Also, identify local land use and zoning ordinance in the vicinity of the airport. This helps ensure compatible development. Very complex airports with many facilities may need to separate tables and data onto additional sheets to maintain legibility. In this example, the airport property map data on sheets 10 and 11 became so extensive that the tables had to be split off on a dedicated airport property data sheet for clarity. Be sure to identify all existing and future airport property, including parcels acquired in fee or easement. All airport ownership and encumbrances should be clearly labeled in both the map and the accompanying data tables. In review, when preparing or updating your ALP, always start by carefully reviewing the MnDOT ALP checklist to ensure your drawing set is fully comprehensive. Use the alphanumeric reference labels to quickly navigate between sheets and required elements to make sure you haven't overlooked anything. Be sure to get MnDOT approval before deviating from the standard sheet structure and content. If you have any other questions while preparing your ALP, from data sources to design standards, reach out to your regional MnDOT office for guidance. They can help clarify requirements and discuss any unique circumstances for your airport. Following these MnDOT standards and best practices will help make your ALP review and approval process as smooth and efficient as possible. A quality, up-to-date ALP puts your airport in the best position to coordinate funding and implement your development plans.
All right, so quick look at the video here. So we've got so all of the resources that we've just discussed here can be found on the State Aeronautics website. It can be you can access it via the Aeronautics and Aviation homepage, and specifically the third tab over for airports. You can then scroll down to the planning and zoning section. In that section, you can access the Airport Layout Plan Guidelines PDF, the Airport Layout Plan Example layout plan that we had just taken a look at and the video had just walked through. The airport layout plan review checklist PDF, as well as the airport layout plan video YouTube. So all of that information can be easily accessed via the aeronautics website and directly at dot.state.mn.us/aero/airports will take you directly to the airports tab containing all of this information. So would encourage everyone to take a look at that, look at that information. And then some of the state of Minnesota ALP considerations. So one of the big ones, and we had mentioned it previously here, but reach out to your regional planner. Communicate and coordinate with your regional planner early and often for your planning project. So early coordination can reduce the need for modifications that have a cascade effect throughout the airport layout plan or throughout the project. So specifically, feel free to reach out to myself in the South region, John Fleming in the Central region, or Brian McMahon in the North region. Any of us would be happy to sit down on a meeting, invite us to your alternatives meeting, invite us to your master plan meeting, anything like that. Get us involved early and often so we can get a plan to move forward and try to avoid having to go back and make modifications that might kind of sweep through the entire airport layout plan and take some additional time and such like that. So early coordination and identification of the critical design aircraft specifically can minimize cascading impacts throughout the ALP. Some of these impacts include safety area dimensions, clear zone dimensions. That was a big one. We just talked about that one previously, directly related to the funding prioritization model. So it impacts with that if, determining that appropriate clear zone size will then impact what amount of land we need to control in that region. Approach surface dimensions, which is closely related to zoning dimensions as well. And both of those are directly related here. Approach surface dimensions are going to dictate to some extent which areas we might have obstructions in, and then also are going to drive our zoning dimensions that we need, as well as taxiway separations. So I just want to reiterate the fact that early communication with your regional planner to get everybody on the same page will hopefully reduce any need to go back through the ALP and make adjustments throughout the whole process. So that's what we had to walk through, kind of just the state perspective on what we need to be able to approve your airport layout plan, but we'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thanks so much, Chris. Everyone feel free to utilize the chat, the Q&A, whatever is easiest for you to find and click on, and we can answer any questions here. We have some time left. Take a look here. All right. Well, thanks so much for once again providing all this information, Chris. Awesome information. Again, Chris's contact is there if you need anything. We look forward to seeing you at the next webinar, and hopefully we see you all at the airports conference. Chris and I will be there. And thank you so much.
One more plug quick. If anybody is interested in volunteer opportunities for upcoming Oshkosh, feel free to reach out to myself at MnDOT Aeronautics, as we are looking for booth volunteers. Thanks, everybody.
Fantastic. Thank you.